All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, if there's anything I learned in politics over the last few months, it is this. The culture war is king. Most things that people affirmatively want do not matter. The major thing that motivates people at the ballot box is what the other side might do if they take power. It's a hellish place to be, but we have to be honest about exactly where we are. And the worst part about that electoral and political dynamic is that you actually care about getting something done, then you're mostly SOL because nobody else in DC has an incentive to work with you. Doing actual work takes effort, something most politicians don't want to do, and they know they won't get rewarded for it. Trump knew this, and so did many of the people who worked for him. He and the people who work for him, they talked a very big game about sticking it to China and rebuilding America. In some cases, they broke legitimately new ground. But in others, let's be honest, they talked a lot and they didn't do anything. They didn't actually have to do anything because at the end of the day, more people still voted for him in 2020 than in 2016. Now look, I remain deeply skeptical of Joe Biden. I do not think he will be a transformative president. In many ways, that's what he was elected to do, just kind of sit around and not be Trump. And given his abysmal lack of real effort so far, I think he's borne that out. But I do want to give him credit for actually paying attention to a problem that if Trump was serious about, would have focused on while he was in office: semiconductors. Yes, semiconductors. I know a million eyes are glazing over, but I want you all to stick with me because these things basically run everything around us, which means that those who control semiconductors run the present and the future. They're literally in everything, from your phone to your gaming console to your fridge to your alarm clock to your car. And like with PPE and other critical things during the pandemic, we found out the hard way about our decision to offshore everything just to save a few dollars in the short term. We are in the middle of a semiconductor crisis in America. It's decades in the making, and it's the crisis that we face today. It's the story of America and its economy itself. Once upon a time, America was the world's leader in semiconductor manufacture. Much of the technology and intellectual property, it was developed right here on our shores. To put it in perspective, in 1990, 37% of the world's chips were manufactured right here. Today, it's 12%. We consume a hell of a lot more than 12% of the world's semiconductors. How did this happen? Because the people buying the semiconductors wanted cheaper ones, and Singapore, South Korea, China, and Taiwan were happy to oblige them. Not because they were doing it better than us, but because their governments massively subsidized the industry and undercut our companies' ability to compete. The government here did not bat an eye. Just let the jobs and the capacity shift right overseas at the exact same moment that semiconductors became more essential than ever. So what's the problem with that? First of all, let's take a look at a map. Does it really make sense to not have a real backup plan when the largest chip makers are anywhere between 100 and a few hundred miles from the range of Chinese missiles? And in one case, the place where it happens is literally claimed as Chinese territory, known as Taiwan. Yeah, that doesn't seem so smart. But national security implications aside, what happens when markets get screwy? You guessed it. We don't have an ability to guarantee supply. And what happens in that case? American companies, and worse, American workers, suffer. General Motors, our most famous car company, has to literally shut down 3 factories because of a shortage in semiconductors. They could lose as many as 10,000 vehicles produced. And new estimates say the auto industry alone is going to lose $61 billion, yes, billion dollars in sales, all for want of semiconductors. Auto sales are the tip of the iceberg. Now imagine if we didn't have just a pandemic and we instead had a war, maybe one that we weren't even involved in, something in Asia. Well, guess what? We literally have to shut down production of all consumer electronics, cars, and household appliances to the extent that we even make them here anymore. This is what the people who run this country have gotten us into. And the biggest problem is how the hell to get out of this. It takes billions and billions and billions of dollars, and worse, lots and lots of time. It could cost a ton of money to build the infrastructure to manufacture semiconductors, and there currently is literally no way to do it without waiting several years until your first chip rolls off the assembly line. The Asian economies understood this years ago. They were poised for the future, and our greed stood in the way of our common sense, and we should have gotten back years ago. And the reason I'm covering it today is because I'm sure most of you had no idea this was even a problem. But people legitimately concerned about industrial policy have been talking about this for years. If Donald Trump was a serious president, a massive U.S. subsidy of semiconductors and competitor to TSMC would have been stood up under him. And during coronavirus, someone like Peter Navarro would have used the Defense Production Act to funnel billions of dollars towards innovation in that sector. We could have had a World War II-style response, and instead, we got some lame tweets. Will Joe Biden do any of that? No, probably not. But at least he held a meeting yesterday with bipartisan lawmakers in the Oval Office on the issue, and then he gave a speech about it. He signed an executive order looking at our supply chain. These are tiny, boring things which make government tick, and people like Tom Cotton and Chuck Schumer are ready to go on it. But it requires a prolonged commitment to actually solving the problem. That's something Republicans on a national scale have lacked for a long time. If we want to be a less decadent and ridiculous country, then manufacturing the very backbones of our modern lives is a great place to start. At least the Biden team is doing something here. And if he fails, then someone else should strive to replace him and outdo him. That is maybe how we get a better politics, although I am not particularly optimistic. And so part of the problem, Crystal, and we've talked about this here before, which is that when it's Trump and he comes and he talks a big game and does nothing, then the best alternative is Biden, who is basically throwing crumbs. Executive order, okay, that's great. Yesterday, actually, you sent me this. Somebody in the Oval Office asked him, are you going to do Defense Production Act? And he heard the question but didn't answer.
Yeah, so it's specifically about semiconductors.
Specifically about semiconductors. So it's not like he's committed to a multi-billion-dollar subsidy or whatever. But okay, a U.S. supply chain review is the best we're going to get at this time. I'm not going to celebrate. But it's better than what Trump did. And this is, first of all, shows the trap that we fall into politics. Perfect. But second, the reason I'm covering this is there's no culture war here. It's just like, we need this to make stuff. There's no, if there was a way to make a culture war, in a way it would be better because at least people would fight over it and they would at least pay attention. But it's one of those just hidden things which is in the backbone of our entire modern life and then just gets offshored.
We could just tie it somehow into the 1619
yes,
project.
Fine.
We could get
the
coverage.
New York Times to cover the damn thing. Just imagine. Currently, 47% of the world's semiconductors are designed and owned by U.S. companies, but only 12 are made here in the United States. Why? Because it's cheaper and we have all the service sector jobs here, like Intel and all them. They design the chips, and then everybody in Taiwan makes it. Does it make any sense to let the Taiwanese, which is already not even acknowledged as a legitimate country by our world's number 2 competitor, China, in order to have all this critical supply? And then the next plant that's being stood up in America, it's not owned by us. It's owned by the Taiwanese. They could pull production and funding anytime they want.
Yeah.
These are the types of things which leave us so vulnerable.
Well, and so a couple of things. Yeah. Number one, you would think that we all would have learned this lesson from the coronavirus crisis.
Yes.
When at the very beginning it was like, oh, crap, we don't make any
ventilators, right?
Yeah, we don't make we don't have the ventilator. We don't make just the basic PPE here that we need. And so there was a real sort of red alarm moment where everybody had this realization of oh shit, we're really vulnerable in these key issues, different pharmaceutical ingredients, all this stuff made overseas, and that leaves us vulnerable when we really need it for our population. This goes very much hand in glove with that. The other thing I was thinking about is what we talked about with regards to Texas earlier, which is the high cost of low prices.
Yes.
Same thing here. They're the price, it'll be a few dollars or a few pennies or a few whatever percentage points cheaper. So sure, let it go overseas without having any sort of other value other than the profit margin at that point in time. This very short-term thinking, ignoring the long-term implications. It's just if I can get it a little bit cheaper for what I need it for, then that's all fine and good. And you can see over the long term the way that has devastating potential consequences. We see that time and time again. And the parallel with Texas is the same thing. What they were sold on is, if you deregulate, it's going to be cheaper for consumers. Right. And, it's going to be way better with the free market, et cetera, et cetera. Not only did it end in a catastrophic failure, but actually there was a Wall Street Journal report that came out yesterday. I think it was something like consumers paid $28 billion more in Texas than they did in other places where the utilities were regulated. So again, even that promise of low prices ends up not being real in the end. It's just like the siren song, the immediate hit of like, it'll be a little bit cheaper. And that's the only value that we have in this country.
I want to underscore, too, the complicity of people, because guess who lobbied for Chinese semiconductors back in 2003? The President of the United States' brother, George W. Bush's brother, Neil Bush, signed a $2 million contract. That's what I was looking up while she was talking. Chinese semiconductor deal called Grace Semiconductor Manufacturer Corp. These are all people. They knew what they were doing.
Gross.
And this is the thing, too.
At the same time, W was the one that deregulated the Texas energy markets.
So, look, we knew that this was going to be an issue, but we allowed it to go because of temporary profit. And it's not like the Taiwanese or the Chinese or the Singaporeans are better at building it than us. No, we actually design all of the chips. It's that their governments were willing to subsidize production and knew that we were greedy bastards and that we would let a temporary 3% decrease or whatever in the price of chip allow all of our domestic capacity to shift. Now, 20 years later, we're like, oh shit, we can't make chips. And oh no, it takes 10 years or whatever in order to stand up a fab. And believe me, I've dug into this. The amount of end-to-end like stuff that you need to do and the billions of dollars that it costs. Because Congress is like, we're willing to throw money. And people in this industry are like, yeah, like money's great, but actually you need all these parts and like it takes a long time to build. Like, you can't just build your way out of these things. Yeah. That's how all manufacture industry and all this stuff works, is it, especially in the 21st century, it requires immense amounts of IP, investment, personnel, planning, and more, and it takes years and years and years. And this is the problem. And now, maybe 5 years from now, where's the industry going to go? China has been invested in this multi-billions, and we are just a much more vulnerable country for no reason with the total complicity of the people who run it. Yeah. That's the part.
So well said.
All right. I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.